Moving into a new house had always been something I looked forward to, an adventure, a fresh start. When I found a quaint house in a small, quiet town, I thought I had found the perfect place. The house was charming, with its old brick walls and a large backyard that stretched into a dense forest. It was the kind of place that felt like home the moment I stepped through the door. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days unpacking, settling in, and exploring the neighborhood. The locals were friendly enough, though they all seemed to have a peculiar unease about them, like they carried some secret just beneath the surface. I shrugged it off as small-town quirkiness, something I wasn't used to coming from a busier, more impersonal city life. But one thing I couldn't ignore was the neighbor next door. His house was a shack, a decrepit old thing that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. It was almost entirely hidden behind overgrown weeds and a rotting wooden fence. The paint had peeled away, and the windows were dark, dusty, and covered with grime. I rarely saw any movement over there, and whenever I did, it was just a flicker of shadows, as if someone were walking by a candle inside. There were no lights, no sign of life, no sounds. At first, I thought the house was abandoned, but then, one afternoon while mowing the lawn, I saw him. He was standing just on the other side of the fence, watching me. His figure was hunched, dressed in layers of old, tattered clothing. His face was gone, skin stretched thin over his cheekbones, and his eyes were a dull gray, barely visible beneath a large, floppy hat that shaded most of his features. When our eyes met, I felt a chill run down my spine. He was completely still, like a statue. For a long and comfortable moment, neither of us moved. Then he smiled. His teeth were yellowed, and his lips cracked as they stretched into a grin that seemed to take far too much effort. "You're new here, aren't you?" he rasped in a hoarse voice. There was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. "Why don't you come by my house sometime, get to know your neighbor?" I've been here a long time, longer than most. I didn't know what to say. My gut told me to decline, to make an excuse, but my mouth worked faster than my brain. "Sure," I muttered, "maybe tomorrow." He nodded slowly, then turned and shuffled back into his shack, disappearing into the darkness. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the strange feeling he left me with. The way he moved, the way he looked at me, it all felt wrong. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and the next evening, as the sun began to set, I found myself standing at his front door. It creaked open before I could knock, and I hesitated for a moment. I peered inside, half expecting him to be standing there, but there was nothing. The house was nearly pitch black, the only light coming from a few dim candles scattered around the room. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the furniture looked ancient, as if it hadn't been used in decades. Hello. I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response. I took a cautious step inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, and I could barely make out the shapes of the furniture. A table, a few chairs, and something that looked like an old piano covered in a thick layer of dust. I tried calling out again, louder this time, but the only sound was the faint flickering of the candle flames. A sense of dread began to settle over me. I couldn't understand why I was feeling so unnerved. He was just an old man, right? But as I took another step into the room, I realized something was terribly wrong. He wasn't there. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. I had seen him walk into the house the day before, and I hadn't heard him leave since. Where could he have gone? My heart began to race as I moved toward the back of the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The shadows seemed to shift around me, playing tricks on my eyes, and the deeper I went, the colder the air became. At the far end of the room, there was a small table, and on it, something caught my eye. A single candle illuminated a worn, yellowed piece of paper. Next to the paper was a small photograph in a cracked frame. I leaned in closer to examine it, and my blood ran cold. It was a photo of the neighbor, the same gaunt face, the same floppy hat, but something was off. He looked much younger in the picture, and his eyes, though hollow, seemed almost alive. Underneath the photo was a note, written in spidery, and even handwriting. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Born 1759, died 1847. I stared at the note in disbelief. My hands trembled as I picked up the photograph, hoping it was some kind of sick joke. But as I held it up to the candlelight, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. Behind the man in the photo, standing in the background, was the shack. The same one I was standing in now, the same crumbling walls, the same rotting fence. The photo looked ancient, like it had been taken over 100 years ago. Panic began to set in. I needed to get out of there. I turned and rushed toward the front door, but when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. I twisted it, pulled with all my strength, but the door remained locked, as if it had been sealed shut. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around the room, searching for another way out. Then I heard it. A low, rasping chuckle from somewhere upstairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps followed the laughter, descending the stairs with a heavy, creaking thud. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no other exit. The windows were boarded up, the back door blocked by piles of debris. The only way out was through the front door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could hear the soft rustle of clothing, as if someone was dragging their feet along the floor. I backed away from the stairs, my eyes darting to the windows, the walls, searching for any way to escape. Then, in the dim light of the candles, I saw it. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs, a dark figure slowly making its way down. It was hunched over, just like the neighbor, but its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. As it descended, the light from the candles flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. I backed up until I hit the wall, my chest tight with fear. The figure stepped into the light, and I could see its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over the skull. Its eyes were hollow sockets, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. It was the neighbor, but not alive. He was a corpse, animated by something unnatural, something evil. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, its head slowly turning to face me. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the blood rushing through my veins. My body was frozen in place, trapped in the grip of terror. Then, without warning, it lunged toward me, its bony fingers outstretched, reaching for me. I didn't think, acted on pure instinct. I ran to the window, grabbed a nearby chair, and smashed it against the glass. The window shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. I didn't hesitate. I climbed through the broken frame, cutting my arms and legs on the jagged edges, and tumbled out onto the ground below. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The woods closed in around me as I sprinted toward my house, the wind whipping through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of that horrible, rasping laughter. I didn't stop running until I reached my front door, slammed it behind me, and locked it tight. I moved out of that house the very next day. I didn't care about the lease, didn't care about the deposit. I packed my things and left, vowing never to return. But here's the thing. A few weeks later, as I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I found something strange. Tucked inside one of my bags was a small, yellowed piece of paper. It was the same note I had found on the table in the shack, the one with the neighbor's birth and death dates. I threw it away, but every night since, I've had the same dream. I'm standing in that shack, surrounded by darkness, and I can hear the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Each night, they get closer and closer. I'm afraid of what will happen when they reach the bottom. It all started the week my new neighbor moved in. The house next door had been vacant for almost a year, ever since the last owners packed up and left without much explanation. I hadn't thought much of it, though. It was an old place, tucked back off the main road, surrounded by woods that seemed to swallow it whole. Some houses just had a way of making people feel uneasy. When I saw the moving truck pull up one afternoon, I was curious but not overly interested. People moved in and out all the time, especially in this town. The guy who stepped out of the truck was tall, lanky, with dark, disheveled hair. He wore old clothes, the kind you'd expect someone to wear when they're moving, but something about him just seemed off. He didn't smile or wave at me like most new neighbors do. He just went about his business, unloading boxes, all by himself. No friends, no family, no movers. Just him. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the first strange sound. It was a low, rumbling growl, almost like an animal. At first, I thought it might be a stray dog wandering through the woods. I lived near a dense forest, and it wasn't uncommon for wildlife to come close to the houses at night. But as the sound grew louder, more guttural, I felt a creeping unease. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded bigger. I looked out my window, which had a clear view of the neighbor's house. His lights were off, and the place was dark, except for a dim glow coming from one of the upstairs windows. The sound seemed to be coming from that direction, A strange mix of growling and scraping, like something was moving around inside the house. For a moment, I considered going over there, knocking on his door, asking if everything was okay. But something held me back. That uneasy feeling from earlier had settled deep in my gut, and I couldn't shake it. So I closed the window, turned off my light, and tried to ignore it. The next day, I ran into my neighbor for the first time while we were both outside. He was standing on his porch, staring out at the woods, his face pale and gaunt. I mustered up the courage to approach him. "Hey," I said casually. "Just wanted to say welcome to the neighborhood." He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. His eyes were dark, almost sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice rough, as if he'd been yelling or growling all night. I was tempted to ask about the noise, but something about his demeanor stopped me. Instead, I asked him what he did in the evenings, trying to be friendly. "I go to bed early," he replied flatly. "I don't do much at night." His answer didn't sit well with me. I wanted to believe him, but the sounds I had heard the night before said otherwise. I forced a smile and nodded, but as I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I decided to keep watch. I set up a chair by my window, keeping the curtains slightly parted so I could see his house. I watched as his lights flickered on at dusk, as he moved about his home, preparing for what seemed like an ordinary evening. Around 9, I saw him upstairs, turning off the lamp in his bedroom. His silhouette passed the window, and then the house was plunged into darkness. I waited out for a long time. Nothing happened. The night was quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling through the trees. Just as I was starting to think I was being paranoid, it happened again. That growling. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. My heart began to race. I leaned closer to the window, straining my eyes to see anything in the darkness. The sound was coming from the neighbor's house again, from that same upstairs window where I'd seen him turn off the light. Then I saw movement. Something was crawling out of the house. At first, I thought it was a person, but the way it moved wasn't human. It was on all fours, its body low to the ground, and its movements were quick, almost jerky. It had fur, thick and dark, and its limbs were long, too long for a human. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was some kind of creature, like a wolf but much larger. Its head was massive, its snout elongated, and its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. It crawled out of the window, its clothes scraping against the roof as it leapt to the ground. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away as the creature landed with a thud and began to move toward the woods. It moved with an unsettling grace, its body low to the ground, like it was hunting. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees. I sat there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? But the sounds, the growling, the way it moved, it had all been too real. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went outside, hoping to see some sign of the neighbor. But his house was eerily quiet, no sign of movement, no sign of life. I waited all day, but he never came outside. The unease that had been building inside me since he moved in was now a full-blown dread. I decided to call the local authorities. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, so I kept it vague. I told them I was concerned about my neighbor, that I hadn't seen him and had heard strange noises coming from his house. They promised to send someone to check on him. When the officer arrived, I watched from my window as he knocked on the door. There was no answer. After a few minutes, the officer tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. He stepped inside, and for a long time, there was nothing. Then the officer emerged, his face pale, shaking his head as he walked back to his car. I rushed outside to ask him what he had found, but he wouldn't say much. Just that the house was empty, no sign of the neighbor, no sign of anyone having lived there recently. I didn't tell him about the creature. I didn't know how to. For days after that, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The growling, the creature, the way it had crawled out of the house, it haunted my thoughts, my dreams. I began to avoid looking at the neighbor's house, terrified that I might see something again. And then, one night, it happened. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, when I heard the sound again. That familiar growling, but this time, it was closer. Much closer. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The growling was coming from right outside my window. I slowly got out of bed, my hands shaking, and crept over to the window. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled the curtain aside, The creature was there, standing just a few feet away. It was even larger up close, its fur bristling, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It stood on all fours, its massive body blocking the view of the neighbor's house. But as I stared at it, frozen in terror, I realized something even more horrifying. It was wearing clothes, tattered, ripped clothes, the same ones my neighbor had been wearing when I saw him the first day he moved in. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this the neighbor? Had he turned into this thing? Or had the creature taken his place? As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the creature slowly turned its head toward me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It bared its teeth in a snarl, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. Then, without warning, it bolted into the woods, disappearing into the trees just as it had before. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about my house, didn't care about anything but getting away from whatever that thing was. I never looked back, never returned to that town, but every now and then, late at night, I still hear that growling in my dreams. And when I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. I was looking for a place to get away for a while. Somewhere quiet, remote, where I could disconnect from the constant noise of the city. After a bit of searching, I found the perfect spot. It was a cabin rental in a small, almost abandoned area tucked away deep in the mountains. There were only a few cabins spread far apart from one another, nestled among dense woods and old, winding trails. It seemed perfect for a weekend of peace. The owner of the property was friendly, but he warned me about something strange. He told me that there was an old woman living in one of the cabins nearby. People around these parts said she was a witch, a real one. He laughed it off, saying it was just silly local folklore, but his eyes had an uneasiness behind them that I couldn't quite ignore. I brushed it off too. What was a trip to the mountains without a bit of local flavor? The cabin I rented was simple but cozy. It had everything I needed. The air was crisp, the forest was quiet, and there was an eerie but peaceful stillness to the place. I settled in, built a fire in the hearth, and spent the afternoon reading and enjoying the solitude. As the sun set behind the trees, the air turned colder. The cabin, lit only by the flickering fire, seemed to shrink as shadows danced along the walls. I had just started to prepare something to eat when I heard it, a knock at the door. It was soft at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. I paused, unsure if I had heard anything at all. Then the knock came again, louder this time, and more deliberate. I opened the door. Standing there, hunched and cloaked in a tattered shawl, was an old woman. Her skin was wrinkled and pale, her eyes sharp and glinting in the twilight. Her mouth curled into a crooked smile, revealing yellow teeth. For a moment, I was frozen. She looked like something out of an old fairy tale, the kind that didn't have happy endings. I nodded slowly, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. "No thanks, I have everything I need here," I said, stepping back and starting to close the door. Her smile faded instantly. She glared at me, her eyes narrowing with something dark and threatening. She spoke again, but now her voice had a cold, biting edge to it. "You should come." It would be unwise to refuse. A chill ran down my spine, but I held my ground. I shut the door in her face. There was silence for a moment, and I started to breathe again, thinking it was over. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, as if something heavy had been thrown against it. I jumped, my heart pounding. The old woman's voice, now shrill and filled with rage, screamed from the other side. "You'll regret this." She pounded on the door again, then once more. The sound echoed through the cabin, unnerving in its intensity. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped. I stood there, staring at the door, not daring to move, waiting to see if she would come back. But she didn't. The rest of the evening was a blur of unease. I tried to distract myself, turning on some music, reading a book, anything to keep my mind off what had happened. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, I climbed into bed, exhausted but too anxious to fall asleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I pulled the blankets tighter around me, trying to ignore the creeping fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. Sometime after midnight, I finally dozed off, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by the strangest, most vivid dream. In the dream, I was standing at the window, looking out at the old woman's cabin in the distance. There was a fire burning outside, large and bright, its flames licking the sky. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The dream had been so real. I sat up, wiping the sweat from my forehead, and something compelled me to go to the window. I hesitated, not wanting to look, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled back the curtain and stared out into the night. There it was. A massive fire burned in front of the old woman's cabin. The flames were unnaturally high, illuminating the trees in an eerie, flickering light. I squinted, trying to make out what was happening, and then I saw her. The old woman stood at the edge of the fire, her hands raised high above her head. She was chanting something, but I couldn't hear the words. Surrounding her were figures, at least a dozen of them, cloaked and hooded, standing in a circle around the fire. They were all facing her, silent and still. My mouth went dry. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. What was I seeing? Some kind of ritual. Then, without warning, the old woman leapt into the flames. I gasped, stumbling back from the window. My heart was hammering in my chest. She had just thrown herself into the fire, and now her body was engulfed in flames, but there was no scream of pain. There was no sound at all. She just burned, her figure twisting and contorting as the flames consumed her. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the horrific sight in front of me. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fire went out. The flames vanished, leaving nothing but darkness where the cabin had stood. The hooded figures were gone, and the clearing was empty. I stumbled away from the window, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Was it real, or had it all been some kind of hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I kept expecting to hear the old woman's voice at the door again, or to see those hooded figures standing outside, watching. At the first light of dawn, I packed my things. I didn't care about getting my money back or explaining myself to the owner. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As I loaded my car, I glanced one last time in the direction of the old woman's cabin. It was still there, looking as ordinary as ever. There was no sign of the fire, no sign of the ritual, nothing. It looked as if nothing had happened at all, but something had. I drove away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until much later, after I had put miles between myself and that cursed place, that I noticed something strange. In the passenger seat, there was a small card that I hadn't noticed before. It looked old, its edges yellowed with age, and there was something written on it in faded ink. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and read the words, "Come back soon." I threw the card out the window and pressed harder on the gas. But even now, after all these years, I can still hear the old woman's voice sometimes, late at night, whispering in the wind, "You'll regret this." And sometimes, just sometimes, when I look out into the darkness, I see the faint flicker of flames dancing in the distance, calling me back. I had lived in my house for about 5 years, and up until a few months ago, I had no issues with the neighbor. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, and we rarely exchanged more than a casual greeting when we happened to see each other. Our properties were separated by a tall wooden fence, old but sturdy, and honestly, I liked it that way. It gave us both privacy, and I never felt the need to pry into his business. That all changed when I noticed the first hole. It was early spring, and I was out in my backyard, enjoying the fresh air after a long winter. As I walked along the fence, I spotted a small, jagged hole about the size of a grapefruit in one of the lower panels. The wood looked like it had been gnawed or clawed at, splintered and frayed in a way that didn't look like it had been caused by the usual wear and tear. I crouched down, peering through to the other side, but all I could see was my neighbor's overgrown lawn. It was strange, but I chalked it up to some wild animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I made a mental note to patch it up later. A few days later, I noticed another hole, this time in a different spot. It was larger than the first, and the wood seemed to have been ripped apart with more force. I was starting to get concerned. If it was an animal, it was getting bolder. I wondered if I should tell my neighbor, but I rarely saw him and figured it wasn't really a big deal. I could fix it myself. The third hole appeared about a week after that. By now, I was starting to feel uneasy. The damage was spreading, and I still hadn't caught sight of whatever was causing it. One evening, I finally ran into my neighbor while taking out the trash. I decided to bring it up, half expecting him to be dealing with the same issue. To my surprise, he seemed just as confused as I was. He told me he hadn't noticed anything on his side of the fence, no holes, no damage. We stood there for a moment, staring at the fence that separated our properties. He promised to keep an eye out and went back inside. That night, something happened that shook me to my core. I had a friend visiting, someone I hadn't seen in a while. We spent the evening out on my terrace talking, drinking, and catching up. It was a peaceful night, and the air was still, but as it got later, a strange tension began to creep in. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something wasn't right. The conversation grew quieter, and both of us started to glance toward the garden, as if we expected something to emerge from the darkness. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a sharp, echoing crack, like a gunshot, coming from somewhere nearby. We both jumped, eyes wide, and scanned the area. There was no one around, nothing that would explain the sound. The night was eerily still. We sat there, frozen, listening for any further noises. Minutes passed, and just as we started to relax again, we saw it. A small figure, crouched low to the ground, was moving through the shadows near the fence. It was dark, barely visible, but there was something distinctly off about it. It didn't walk like a person, and it wasn't shaped like any animal I had ever seen. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost like it was gliding across the ground. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the creature stopped in front of the fence. With long, thin claws, it began to cut through the mesh of the wire in a swift, precise motion. The sound of the metal being sliced sent chills down my spine. My friend and I watched in stunned silence, too terrified to move. Then it stopped. The creature must have sensed us because it slowly turned its head in our direction. Its eyes, or what I assumed were its eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, like to dull embers. For a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in place. And then it bolted. It moved so fast I barely saw it, disappearing into the neighbor's yard and darting toward his old, dilapidated shed. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my friend whispered in disbelief, asking what the hell that thing was. Neither of us slept that night. We stayed inside, every little noise making us jump, both of us convinced that the creature would come back. The next morning, I knew I had to tell my neighbor. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but he needed to know that something had been in his yard. When I knocked on his door, he answered, looking as tired and uneasy as I felt. I told him everything. The holes in the fence, the strange creature, how it had run into his shed. But instead of the concern I expected, he just stared at me blankly. He denied that anything had happened. No creature, no holes, no strange noises. He told me he had been home all night and heard nothing out of the ordinary. I was stunned. I had seen it with my own eyes. My friend had seen it too. I didn't know what to say. I left feeling unsettled, as if I had just spoken to someone who was pretending not to understand. The following day, the neighbor's house was empty. He had moved out. No warning, no explanation. I hadn't seen a moving truck. No signs that he had been packing. He was just gone. The only indication that he had ever lived there was the overgrown lawn and that old shed, which now stood abandoned, and a neighbor moved in a few days later. A young couple, friendly enough, though we didn't talk much. I wondered if I should tell them what had happened, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way they looked at the house, as if they were relieved to have found such a quiet, peaceful place. I didn't want to disturb that illusion. Since then, nothing strange has happened. No more holes in the fence, no eerie noises, no sign of the creature. It was as if it had disappeared along with the old neighbor. I almost started to believe it had all been in my head. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I decided to take a walk near the neighbor's shed, just to ease my curiosity. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way in a hurry. I approached cautiously, pushing it open with a creak. Inside, the shed was dark and cluttered with old tools and forgotten junk. But there, on the dirt floor, half buried beneath some leaves and debris, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a piece of metal mesh, cut cleanly in the same way I had seen the creature do to the fence. And next to it, small but unmistakable, were claw marks, gouged deep into the wooden floor. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I didn't know what I had seen, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the far wall of the shed, written in what looked like charcoal, was a single word: stay. I slammed the door and walked back to my house, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to step outside. I never saw the creature again, and I never went back to that shed. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear something moving just beyond the fence, something scraping at the wood, as if it's trying to find a way in.